Today I'm going to show you how to set a tile and what tools to make it the easiest. First, you'll definitely want some gloves to keep the thin set off your hands, because once that stuff dries, it's really hard to get off. And then a clean bucket of water with a sponge to make cleanup as you go super easy, because the last thing you want to do is get thin set all over the place and let it dry. So if you can wipe away the thin set as you go, that's the way to do it. You need a trowel that is the right size, so depending on what size tile you need, the larger the tile, the larger the little forks there you'll need. So you need a trowel, and then you want to make sure you clean this really well after you're done, and then dry it off so it doesn't rust. It's also helpful to have a margin trowel, so then when you set the tile, you can wipe away the thin set around the tile for when you put your spacers in. This also gets in tougher areas, so if it's a smaller area and you can't get the trowel in there, you can put some thin set on with this. And then this is a game changer. So when you get low in your thin set, you can scrape the edges of the bucket to get all the thin set out. So if you need just a little bit more, you can probably scrape it out of your bucket and not have to make a whole another set of thin set. And then for spacers, I like the 1/8 inch guys that just go in behind the tile, in between the two tiles, and then you put the wedge in, which I'll show you, and then you squeeze the wedge tight with this tool. And then for smaller areas, I like to have these little wedges so you can make micro adjustments. So if you need to move the tile just a little bit, you can stick these in anywhere, and they're really easy. Comes in a huge bag, so you don't have to reuse them. When they get thin set all over them, just grab another one. All right, the thin set itself, you want it to be smooth. You want it to hold the ridges just a little bit, so you can see it's holding the trowel marks. That's where you want to see. You don't want to see it completely liquid after you trowel it. You want to be able to see some of those trowel marks. So that's what you're looking for. And obviously as it starts to get dry, it's going to be a little harder to work with, but you can still use it. I mean, depending on the brand. Some brands have a longer pot life, so read up on that. I like ones that have just a little bit of longer pot life. If you use something like a Schluter all set, that has a pretty short pot life, so it's nice because it's sticky, but it's also harder to use the longer you have it. So if you're looking for something that has a little more pot life, I would recommend the Mapai line. All right, another tool that's helpful to have is a laser level. So I'll link mine in the description, but one that has two planes. I'm only using the horizontal plane right now, but you can see I've got it lined up with this tile I already have set. So this is the line I'm going to be using across the top of the tile. I want to line up with my laser line on this one. So this helps you get really straight lines and a really uniform look all across your project. I'll leave a link for that in the description. So I got my horizontal here, and then I just marked my center on the bathtub, what I'm going to use, and I've marked the center of my tile here. So I'm just going to line up the center of the bathtub with the center of this tile, and then base everything off of that. So I've made one cut here, so I know my bottom row left corner here, and then the center full tile, and then I'm going to set these and then make my other cuts so I know exactly where they're going to be. So first thing I'm going to do here is just burn the thin set into the wall here. So that means just putting it on and then making sure it is adhered to the substrate. In this case, this is the hydro block. So just getting a good amount on, and then only going up to my line here because that's where it's going to be. You can use the flat or the edge section of your trowel here, just trying to get it on and make sure there's good coverage. And then you want to keep it away from the edges, because that's just more you have to clean up, because as you squeeze the tile on, it's going to come out of these edges here. So the more you can avoid that, the easier the cleanup is going to be, and then the less you have to dig out the thin set between joints. Alright, I've got my thin set on. I'm just going to make unified trowel marks in one direction. So that allows the air to come out. If you have a bunch of different directions, the air pockets might form behind the tile, and you don't want that. So having it in one direction, the air can escape, the ridges can collapse, and you'll have a good seal. It really doesn't matter what direction. So here you can see I got a little messy at the bottom here. This is where the margin trowel comes in handy. You could use your hand, I guess, but then it'd be getting all dirty. So I'm just gonna wipe away that excess. And like I said, you want to avoid having a ton of extra here, especially at the bottom, because it's just going to squeeze out. And then a little bit on the side here. See, there's that extra. Alright, now this is going to be my bottom left tile here. Now we're ready to burn the thin set onto the tile. So basically you're looking to, if you can see all these little honeycomb ridges here, you're basically trying to get the thin set all into these things, so that once you apply it to the actual wall, it bonds to that thin set. Because this part of the thin set is already bonded to the tile, so it actually just bonds to the thin set on the wall, and you have a really strong bond. So we're trying to fill all of these little honeycombs. So this is where it comes in handy to use the flat side of the trowel, and helpful if you do it over the bucket, depending on how thick or thin your thin set is. So you can see all those little ridges are not exposed anymore. So you can see if you don't do it enough, you get little pockets. So you're trying to fill every one of those voids to get it to look like this. You might have to flip the tile around. But just a very thin layer to burn the thin set. And then if you want, you can add just a little more, depending on if you're going to have to come out of the wall just a little bit to meet up with another tile. You might have to put just a little more thin set on, but this one should be pretty good. It shouldn't need much. Alright, so I got thin set on the tile, and now I just want to clean up my edges, because you see it's kind of covering the edge here, so that's what makes it hard to clean up. So we just want to get all that off. This is where it comes in handy to have the bucket of water with a sponge. So basically just wipe each corner to make it really clean. And this is going to really help you later when you're cleaning it up, so you don't have to get a bunch of thin set out between the edges. Alright, so that looks super clean. Now we can set this tile. And then this is where the margin trowel comes in handy again. So we want to clear off this edge here, because if we leave this, the thin set is just going to come out of all those edges, and it's a really pain. So if we clean all these edges now, so just wiping them away, this makes things a lot easier. And then come back with our sponge and make that a super clean edge. And as long as you're not going crazy with thin set on the next tile, this edge will stay pretty clean. So we're ready to put in some of our leveling clips here. So there's just a little back, and that stays behind the tile forever. And then after you put the wedge in and squeeze it in and it dries, you'll actually knock this out with a rubber hammer. So that'll break off right there, and the back of this will stay in behind the tile forever. But sometimes they don't knock out cleanly. Check out my short where I just showed how to cut those off with a blowtorch and heating up a little razor blade. Makes it easier than having to cut it out. You can just melt it off. Alright, so we got these set. I'm actually gonna add another one here. So I know that I'll have a small tile here, so I want to have that with 2 clips, and then another clip at this next tile. Be about there. We want to also watch, because the wedges are going to come in, so you don't want the wedges to hit each other. So you want to have the 11 clips spaced enough so the wedges can squeeze in without running into each other. Alright, now we're ready for the big tile. Again, we're just going to burn this in. Get a little bit on here, and then use the flat end of your trowel. Helpful to go different directions. And then I do try to stay just a hair away from the edge, just to again help avoid thin set coming out of the joints. Alright, I'm just going to put a little bit on. So again, depending on how far you got to come out of the wall, you might have to put a little more thin set on the actual tile. And then again, we're going to clean up the edges. Alright. Got my center mark. It's going to go on that center mark, and I've got my horizontal laser. You do want to move the tile around just a little bit to get that nice seal. So that looks pretty good. I know that's going to have to come up a little bit. I got it over a little bit. Just trying to line it up. Alright, now I know where that's going to be. I'm going to clean this one off again. And more line clips. And now I know where that tile is going to be, so I can measure that and cut it up here. So I can get a measurement. You want just a little bit of a gap here on the edge, just for safety so your tiles aren't running into each other. This is where the sponge comes in handy to keep your area nice and clean here, because if you let this thin set dry, it's a lot harder to get off. And then, so here are the wedges. So when you're setting the wedges, just make sure you put the spacing of the clips far enough away so they're not going to run into each other. So put one there. But notice as you put this in, first of all, there's some thin set squeezing out, so try to avoid that if you can, because if you leave this, if you don't clean that out, that's really hard to clean out the next day. Or if you leave it more than a day, it's really, really, really hard to clean out. So if you have to clean your joints, clean them the next day at the very least. So notice this wants to go that way, so you're going to want to put a wedge on the end here before you use your tool to make that tight. So make sure you have wedges in your corners before you make them tight. So once you do that, you just squeeze it down. This goes on this side. You notice it still moved a little bit, so maybe we want to take it out. You can just put pressure here to back out the wedge, and then make sure your wedge on the corner is tight, and maybe hold it even while you squeeze your wedge tight. And that takes away any of the lippage, but you'll need to clean out that space there of thin set. Those are the basics, those are the tools, and basically you just do the same thing over and over again. Just put thin set on the wall, put thin set on the tile, and make sure you're level and all the depths are the same. And then use some tiling clips if you really want to get rid of the lippage. But I hope this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, comments. See you next time.